A cop sees a young girl carrying a heavy backpack every day, rain or shine. At first, he thinks nothing of it, until one morning it slips from her hands. What he finds inside makes his heart stop. This isn't just a school bag, it's survival. Who is she helping? And when he follows her, the truth hidden in the shadows will change everything. Stay for a powerful story of sacrifice, justice, and one man's fight to do what's right, no matter the cost. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning drizzle painted the city's streets in a glossy sheen, droplets tapping against Sergeant Henry Collins's patrol car windshield in a steady rhythm. Steam rose from his coffee cup, fogging the window as he watched the familiar parade of early risers make their way down Mason Street. After 27 years on the force, these quiet morning shifts had become as natural as breathing, though lately they felt more like a countdown to an ending he wasn't sure he wanted. Shop owners pulled up their metal shutters with metallic clanks, nodding familiar greetings his way. Kids in bright raincoats splashed through puddles, backpacks bouncing as they rushed to beat the school bell, their laughter cutting through the gray morning air. Business people hurried past with umbrellas tilted against the rain, their shoes clicking on wet concrete like a metronome marking time. Collins took another sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. The coffee shop across the street made it too strong, but it was part of his routine now, like the crack in his dashboard and the squeaky driver's seat. Everything was routine these days, predictable as the sun rising over the city skyline. That's when he saw her again. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, but she walked with the heavy steps of someone carrying the world on their shoulders. Her oversized backpack looked ready to burst, straining against worn zippers that caught the dim morning light. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, visible even from where Collins sat in his car, making her look older than her years. She passed by his usual spot every morning at exactly 7:15, rain or shine, like clockwork. Today, the weight of her bag seemed to pull her slightly to one side as she trudged through the drizzle, her shoulders hunched against the weather. No umbrella, just a thin jacket that had seen better days. Its blue fabric faded to a tired gray. Collins found himself straightening in his seat, watching as she made her way down the street, his coffee forgotten in its cup holder. There was something about her that didn't fit with the usual morning crowd. Other students traveled in chattering groups or at least had parents dropping them off in warm cars. This girl always walked alone, her eyes fixed on the sidewalk ahead. He'd first noticed her about 2 weeks ago, and since then she'd become part of his mental checklist of the morning watch. The baker at 6:30 with his flour-dusted apron, newspaper delivery at 6:45 in that rattling old truck, the crossing guard at 7 with her bright orange vest, and now this girl at 7:15, always with that same enormous backpack that seemed to grow heavier each day. "What are you carrying, kid?" he muttered to himself, watching her disappear around the corner like she did every morning, swallowed by the crowd of commuters and the morning mist. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of routine calls and paperwork, each task another tick mark on the day's checklist. But as the day faded into night, Collins found himself sitting in his apartment, the TV casting dancing shadows on the walls. The whiskey in his glass caught the light as he swirled it absently, ice cubes clinking against the sides. The evening news droned on about city council meetings and weather forecasts, but his mind kept drifting back to the girl. 27 years of police work had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about her situation felt off, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Most kids complained about carrying too many books, but her bag looked like it could hold half a grocery store. She never stopped to talk to anyone, never met up with friends, just walked with that singular purpose, shoulders bent under her burden, disappearing into the morning crowd like a ghost. Collins took another sip of whiskey, feeling the familiar burn. The empty apartment seemed to echo with questions he couldn't answer, the silence broken only by the hum of his aging refrigerator. His wife would have known what to do. Sarah had always been better at these things, at seeing past the surface to the heart of a problem. But Sarah was gone 5 years now, leaving behind only memories and fading photographs, and he was left alone with his cop's intuition telling him something wasn't right. The TV flickered, casting blue shadows across the coffee table, where his badge lay next to an empty takeout container, the remnants of another solitary dinner. Just 6 months left until retirement. 6 months of morning watches, routine patrols, and filing reports. He should be counting down the days, planning fishing trips, or thinking about that condo in Florida everyone said he should buy. Instead, he sat in his dimly lit living room, unable to shake the image of a teenage girl carrying a mystery on her back, walking alone through the rain. The thought nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch, a reminder that maybe he wasn't quite ready to hang up his badge just yet. The next morning brought a deluge that transformed the city streets into miniature rivers. Rain hammered against Colin's patrol car, creating a thunderous drumbeat that made his usual morning coffee taste even more bitter than usual. Windshield wipers swept frantically across the glass, fighting to maintain visibility in the downpour. The weather matched his mood, dark and brooding after another sleepless night wondering about the mysterious girl. Through the gray curtain of rain, he spotted her familiar figure. Ava's oversized black hoodie was completely soaked, clinging to her small frame as she trudged along the sidewalk. The massive backpack seemed to weigh her down even more today, and Collins noticed how she kept adjusting the straps with trembling hands. Her shoulders hunched against the wind and rain, making her look even smaller than usual. Water cascaded off the brim of her hood as she navigated around growing puddles. Her sneakers were soaked through, making squishing sounds with each careful step. The weight of the bag pulled her backward, forcing her to lean forward just to stay upright. With each gust of wind, she struggled to maintain her balance on the slick concrete. Collins watched as she attempted to shift the backpack's position, her cold fingers fumbling with the wet straps. In that moment, the bag slipped. Ava lurched sideways, trying desperately to maintain her grip, but the momentum was too much. Before he knew what he was doing, Collins was out of his car, rain pelting his uniform, his coffee forgotten on the dashboard. "Need a hand with that?" he called out, moving quickly toward her, his shoes splashing through puddles. Ava's head snapped up, eyes wide with alarm. "No, I got it," she muttered, but her words came too late. The bag slipped from her grasp and hit the wet pavement with a heavy thud that seemed to echo in the rain-soaked morning. The impact forced the struggling zipper to give way. Collins stood transfixed as the contents spilled onto the sidewalk. Cans of soup rolling through puddles, sealed medical kits skittering across concrete, and vacuum-packed blankets unfurling in the rain. This wasn't the contents of a typical school bag. These were survival supplies. The sight made his cop instincts tingle with suspicion and concern. Ava dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered items. Her hands shook as she snatched up the cans, shoving them back into the bag with desperate energy. Water dripped from her hood, mixing with what Collins suddenly realized were tears on her cheeks. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that clouded in the cold morning air. He knelt down to help, reaching for a medical kit, but Ava yanked the bag away from him with surprising force. She hugged it to her chest, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and shame that made his chest tighten. The raw emotion in her gaze struck him like a physical blow. "Where is all this going?" Collins asked softly, rain running down his face. "Who needs these supplies?" His voice was gentle, trying to convey that he wanted to help, not harm. Ava shook her head violently, backing away from him. "I have to go." Her voice cracked as she clutched the bag tighter, knuckles white with strain. Without another word, she turned and ran, her feet splashing through puddles as she disappeared into the curtain of rain, leaving behind only ripples in the water. Collins remained kneeling on the wet sidewalk, his uniform soaked through. His heart pounded as he watched her vanishing figure, knowing with absolute certainty that this was more than just a struggling student. The supplies, the secrecy, the fear in her eyes, it all pointed to something bigger. Who was she helping with all those supplies? The question nagged at him, along with an uncomfortable feeling that he was about to stumble onto something that would change everything. Back at the precinct, Collins sat at his desk, his coffee growing cold beside a stack of unfinished reports. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he stared blankly at his computer screen, his mind replaying the scene from earlier. Cans rolling across wet pavement, medical supplies scattered everywhere, the look of pure fear in Ava's eyes. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling that he was missing something important. Detective Mason's voice cut through his thoughts. Earth to Collins. You've been staring at that same report for 20 minutes. The concern in his tone was unmistakable, the kind that only comes from years of friendship and partnership. Collins blinked, looking up at his old friend. Mason leaned against the desk, arms crossed, concern etched on his weathered face. The afternoon light filtering through the blinds cast shadows across his features. Just distracted, Collins mumbled, but his fingers were already typing Ava's name into the database. Her school record appeared on screen. Ava Johnson, straight A's, perfect attendance despite obvious exhaustion, no disciplinary issues. A model student living with her mother in the East Side's low-income housing. Father's information, blank. Something about that missing piece nagged at him. Something I should know about? Mason asked, peering at the screen. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and professional concern. Collins minimized the window. Just following up on something. He grabbed his jacket, the leather worn smooth from years of use. Need to check on a lead. The bell above Mr. Patel's grocery store chimed as Collins entered. The old shopkeeper smiled in recognition, pausing from restocking shelves. The small store smelled of spices and fresh produce, a welcome change from the sterile precinct air. "Mr. Patel, I was wondering if you could help me with something," Collins said, pulling out his phone with Ava's picture. "This girl, she shop here often?" Mr. Patel's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, Ava. Such a polite girl. Comes in every few days, always buying lots of canned goods, bread, basic supplies." He chuckled, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "At first I thought maybe she ran a shelter or had a very big family, but she lives with just her mother in those apartments on East Side." Collins frowned. "You're sure about the bulk buying?" "Oh yes, sometimes she can barely carry it all, but never complains, that one. Always has a smile, even when she's struggling with those heavy bags." Back at his desk, Collins dug deeper. The Johnson family apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, no records of other dependents. Yet according to Mr. Patel's receipts, which he'd kindly shared, Ava was buying enough food to feed a small army. He cross-referenced dates and quantities, his detective instincts telling him there was more to this story. The sun had set by the time Collins finished his shift, but instead of heading home, he turned his patrol car toward Ava's usual route. Streetlights cast long shadows as he drove slowly, studying every alley, every corner, trying to piece together where a teenage girl might be taking all those supplies. The evening air was cool against his face through the open window. His radio crackled with the usual evening chatter, but Collins barely heard it. His mind was too busy putting together the pieces, the heavy backpack, the bulk purchases, the medical supplies. Ava wasn't just feeding herself or her mother. She was taking care of someone, or maybe several someones. The way she protected those supplies, the desperation in her eyes when they'd scattered across the ground, it all pointed to something bigger than just one family's needs. The question was, who? The city stirred slowly in the pale morning light, puddles from last night's rain reflecting the growing dawn like scattered mirrors on the cracked pavement. Collins sat in his patrol car, fingers drumming against the steering wheel in an anxious rhythm, eyes fixed on the corner where Ava usually appeared. His coffee sat untouched in the cup holder, growing cold, the steam long since disappeared. Right on schedule, she emerged from the morning mist. Her oversized backpack looked ready to burst at the seams, and dark circles rimmed her tired eyes like smudged charcoal. Instead of her usual route toward the school, she veered left, ducking into an alley behind an old warehouse with practiced stealth. Collins waited a few moments, his heart beating faster, then followed on foot, keeping his footsteps quiet on the wet pavement. The alley smelled of garbage and stale rainwater, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes. Graffiti covered the brick walls in layers of faded colors, and broken glass crunched under his shoes like brittle ice. Ahead, Ava disappeared through a rusted metal door that hung slightly open, its hinges groaning softly in protest. His hand instinctively touched his service weapon as he approached the door, the familiar cold metal both reassuring and somehow wrong in this moment. Years of experience told him to be cautious, but something else, curiosity, concern, maybe both, pulled him forward like an invisible thread. He slipped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, the musty air filling his lungs. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The tunnel stretched before him, illuminated by scattered camping lanterns and small fires burning in metal drums, casting dancing shadows on the curved walls. 6 men huddled around the flames, wrapped in thin blankets and wearing tattered military jackets that spoke of better days. Their faces were weathered like old leather, eyes haunted, the unmistakable look of veterans who'd seen too much and couldn't unsee it. A tall, middle-aged black man with broad shoulders and a military bearing noticed Collins first. His stance was military straight despite his ragged clothes and the visible weight of his circumstances, and his eyes held a fierce, protective glare that seemed to pierce right through Collins. "You shouldn't be here, officer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority despite his circumstances, each word measured and deliberate. Ava whirled around at the sound, her face transforming from shock to fury when she saw Collins, like a storm cloud darkening. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, stepping between him and the group, her small frame somehow filling the space. The other veterans tensed visibly, some shrinking back into the shadows while others straightened, ready for confrontation. The atmosphere crackled with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Cops don't help us," the tall man, Curtis, said firmly, shifting his weight forward. "They just move us along. We've been through this before, too many times to count." Ava's hands balled into fists at her sides. "You can't take this from them," she said, her voice trembling with anger and fear, raw emotion bleeding through every word. "They have nowhere else to go. This is all they have." Collins stood frozen, taking in the scene before him. The makeshift beds arranged with military precision, the carefully organized supplies stacked against the walls, the way these men looked at Ava with a mixture of gratitude and protectiveness that spoke of a deeper bond. This wasn't just charity, this was survival in its purest form. Before he could respond, Ava shouldered past him roughly, heading deeper into the tunnels with determined steps. At the edge of the lamplight, she turned back, her face half in shadow, eyes glinting with fierce determination. "Stay out of this," she warned, her voice hard as steel. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Collins remained rooted to the spot, surrounded by the evidence of a hidden world he never knew existed right under the city streets. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like the tons of concrete overhead, forcing him to confront truths he'd been trained to ignore. The precinct buzzed with early morning activity as Collins slumped in his chair during the daily briefing. Coffee cups clinked and chairs squeaked, while Lieutenant Harper stood at the front of the room, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to Collins's rumpled appearance. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the tired faces of his fellow officers, all of them fighting their own battles with the early hour. "And finally," Harper's voice cut through Collins's thoughts sharp as a knife, "the city council has passed a new ordinance regarding homeless encampments." Collins's head snapped up, suddenly alert. The drowsiness that had been clouding his mind evaporated instantly. "Starting next week, we'll begin clearing out all unauthorized camps within city limits," Harper continued, his tone matter of fact, as if he were discussing nothing more important than the weather. "Anyone refusing to leave will be arrested for trespassing. I want all officers ready to assist with these operations. We'll be coordinating with social services, but our primary focus is enforcement." Collins's stomach turned to ice. His mind flashed to the veterans in the tunnel, to Curtis's protective stance, to the meager belongings they'd managed to collect, each item representing a small victory in their daily struggle, to Ava, trying so hard to keep them safe, carrying the weight of their survival on her young shoulders. "Questions?" Harper looked around the room, his gaze sweeping past Collins. Collins gripped his pen tightly, forcing himself to stay quiet, his knuckles white with the effort. As officers filed out after the briefing, their boots squeaking against the linoleum floor, Mason caught up with Collins in the hallway. "Hey," he said, studying Collins's face with the careful attention of a longtime friend. "You look like someone just punched you in the gut. What's eating you?" Collins shook his head, trying to keep his expression neutral, though he could feel the tension in his jaw. "Just tired," he muttered, but his mind was racing. The veterans would have nowhere to go. Everything Ava had worked for would be destroyed, swept away like so much garbage. "If you say so," Mason replied, clearly unconvinced. His eyes lingered on Colin's face a moment longer. "You know where to find me if you want to talk. I mean it." That afternoon, Colin sat in his patrol car, watching Ava walk past with her usual heavy backpack. She had no idea what was coming. Her determined stride, the slight hunch of her shoulders under the weight she carried, it all seemed more poignant now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, making her seem even smaller and more vulnerable than usual. He gripped his steering wheel tightly, wrestling with his conscience. Warning her would mean going against department policy, risking not just a reprimand but his entire career. Not warning her would mean watching everything she'd built crumble, destroying the fragile community she'd created. The choice weighed on him like a physical burden as he watched her disappear around the corner, her shadow stretching out behind her like an accusation. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalk as Collins waited in the gathering darkness. His breath made small clouds in the cool evening air, dancing and dissipating in the growing gloom. He checked his watch again, knowing Ava would appear any minute with her usual delivery, just as she had every night for the past 3 months. Right on schedule, she emerged from around the corner, her oversized backpack weighing heavily on her small frame. The straps dug into her shoulders, and she walked with the careful determination of someone carrying precious cargo. Collins stepped out from his hiding spot, deliberately placing himself in her path. Ava froze, her muscles tensing like a cornered animal. "What do you want?" "There's something you need to know," Collins said, his voice gentle but firm. The words felt like lead in his mouth. "The city passed a new ordinance. They're clearing out all homeless camps next week, including the tunnels." The color drained from Ava's face, making her look even younger than her 17 years. She took a step back, shaking her head, her worn sneakers scraping against the concrete. "You're lying," she whispered, but her eyes searched his face and found only truth there. "I wish I was," Collins replied, the weight of his conscience pressing down on him. "But you need to prepare. They're going to arrest anyone who refuses to leave." Ava's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching along her cheek. "We've been through worse," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. Her fingers gripped the backpack straps until her knuckles turned white. "We'll find another place, we always do." "It's not that simple this time," Collins insisted, running a hand through his gray hair. His wedding ring caught the dim streetlight as he gestured. "The city means business. They want all camps gone, permanently. No exceptions." "You're a cop," Ava said, her voice rising with desperation, echoing slightly in the empty street. "You have power. Do something." Collins spread his hands, feeling helpless despite his authority. "I can help you find proper shelters, get them into programs." "No!" Ava cut him off, the words sharp as broken glass. "I don't want your charity. These men deserve better than that. They need real help, real solutions." Her words hit Collins like a physical blow. "They fought for this country and now you want to throw them out like garbage? Ava, please." She adjusted her backpack, eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and determination. "If you won't help, then stay out of it," she spat, brushing past him toward the alley. The smell of stale bread from her backpack lingered in the air between them. Collins watched her disappear into the darkness of the tunnel entrance, her footsteps fading into silence. He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his badge and everything it represented. The metal felt unusually heavy against his chest tonight. Never in his 23 years on the force had duty and conscience felt so painfully at odds. Collins sat in his dimly lit apartment, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. The whiskey in his glass caught the light, amber liquid reflecting tiny circles onto the wooden table. His eyes fixed on an old service photo propped against the wall, himself 20 years younger, standing proud in his freshly pressed uniform, with a smile that hadn't yet been weathered by time and loss. "What would you tell me to do, Ellen?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice rough with emotion. The memory of his late wife came rushing back clear as yesterday. Ellen, with her kind eyes and unwavering moral compass, always pushing him to look beyond the badge. He could almost hear her voice now, soft but firm, the way she'd speak when he came home troubled by a case when the weight of his duty pressed heavy on his shoulders. "The law isn't perfect, Henry," she'd say, touching his arm gently, her fingers warm and reassuring against his skin. "But you can choose to do what's right." Collins took another sip of whiskey, letting the warm liquid settle in his stomach. His badge lay on the table, the metal dulled in the low light, years of scratches marking its surface like battle scars. 28 years of service, 28 years of following orders, enforcing the law exactly as written. He'd never questioned it before, not really. Never had to face the gap between what was legal and what was right. But now all he could see was Ava's face, the determination in her eyes as she protected those veterans. The way she carried that heavy backpack every day without complaint, her small shoulders bearing a burden no teenager should have to carry. She was just a kid, doing what the system had failed to do, fighting battles that should have been fought by others. "Damn it," he muttered, setting down his glass harder than intended, the sound echoing in the quiet room. The department's orders were clear. Clear out the camps, arrest anyone who resisted. Simple, clean, by the book. But there was nothing simple about forcing those veterans, men who'd served their country, who'd sacrificed everything, back onto the streets. Nothing clean about destroying the only safe haven they had left. Collins picked up his badge, running his thumb over the familiar ridges. He'd always believed that upholding the law meant serving justice. Now, for the first time, those two things felt miles apart, like parallel lines that would never meet. He knew he could stall the eviction, create some bureaucratic delays. It wouldn't stop it forever, but it might buy Ava and the veterans some time. Maybe enough time to figure something out, to find a solution that wouldn't leave them vulnerable and alone. Standing up, Collins walked to his bedroom and opened his dresser drawer. He placed his badge inside, closing it slowly. The soft click of the drawer felt oddly final, like the period at the end of a long sentence. Tomorrow, he'd start working against the very system he'd served for nearly 3 decades. "You'd be proud of this one, Ellen," he whispered, touching the wedding ring he still wore, the gold band warm beneath his fingers. For the first time in years, he felt like the man she'd married, not just an officer following orders, but someone willing to stand up for what was right. Someone ready to risk everything for what he believed in. The pre-dawn air hung heavy with moisture as Collins parked his patrol car a block away from the alley. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension, a grocery bag full of supplies sitting in his passenger seat. Through his windshield, he watched Ava's familiar figure slip into the shadows of the alleyway, her oversized backpack weighing down her small frame as she moved with practiced stealth. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm his nerves, Collins grabbed the bag and stepped out of his car. The concrete was still wet from overnight rain, his footsteps echoing softly as he followed Ava's path. Puddles reflected the dim streetlights like mirrors in the darkness. The rusty metal door creaked as he pulled it open, the sound making him wince and glance nervously over his shoulder. Inside, the tunnel air was thick and musty, carrying the unmistakable smell of too many people living in too small a space. The weak light from scattered lanterns cast long shadows on the concrete walls, dancing with every flicker of flame. Collins could make out the shapes of sleeping figures wrapped in blankets, while others sat hunched around small camping stoves, warming their hands over meager flames. Ava spotted him first, her body tensing immediately, shoulders squaring for confrontation. "What are you doing here?" Curtis Banks emerged from the shadows like a ghost, his military bearing evident even in worn civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame. His eyes narrowed at Collins, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap, hands flexing at his sides. Without a word, Collins held out the grocery bag, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. Ava stared at it, then at him, her jaw set in defiance, chin lifted high. "We don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Collins said, keeping his voice steady and low to avoid waking the sleepers. "Just some confiscated supplies. Guess I forgot to file the report on them." The lie felt bitter on his tongue, but necessary. Curtis stepped forward, arms crossed over his chest, his presence filling the narrow space. His gaze bore into Collins, searching for any sign of deception. "So what's the catch, officer?" The title came out like an accusation. Collins met his stare, forcing himself not to look away. "No catch, but you need to know. The department's planning to clear out these tunnels soon. I'm trying to buy you some time, but..." He let the words hang in the air like the dampness around them. "Buy time?" Ava's voice cracked with anger, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "That's supposed to make everything okay?" Curtis raised a hand, silencing her with the authority of long habit. "How long?" "A few weeks, maybe less. You need to start making backup plans." Collins fought to keep his voice professional, detached, even as guilt gnawed at his insides. Ava's frustration finally boiled over. She stepped right up to Collins, her eyes blazing with a fury that made her seem larger than her small frame. "You don't actually care," she snapped. "You just feel bad. Well, we don't need your guilt." Collins didn't argue. The truth was, he wasn't sure himself anymore. Was he helping because it was right, or just to ease his own conscience? The question sat heavy in his chest as he set the bag down on a nearby crate, the plastic crinkling in the silence. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the entrance, feeling their eyes boring into his back. The morning light filtering through the door seemed harsh after the tunnel's darkness, making him squint. Each step felt heavier than the last as he realized the magnitude of what he'd just done. He wasn't just bending the rules anymore. He was breaking them outright, crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross. There would be no going back from this, and somewhere deep inside he knew his life would never be the same. The precinct hummed with activity as officers gathered for the morning briefing. Collins sat in his usual spot near the back, his coffee untouched and growing cold. The familiar scent of stale donuts and printer ink filled the air as Lieutenant Harper stood at the front, his presence commanding attention as he shuffled through papers on the podium, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across his stern face. "Listen up, people," Harper's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "City Hall wants these encampments cleared, and they want it done fast. We start in 2 days, working our way from the east side to the west. No exceptions." Collins's fingers curled into fists under the table, his knuckles turning white with tension. He watched as Harper pointed to different locations on a projected map, each red mark representing a place where people had made their homes. People like Curtis and the others in the tunnel. Each dot felt like a punch to his gut. "Remember, we're not here to negotiate," Harper continued, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Anyone refusing to leave will be arrested for trespassing. The city's provided a list of shelters they can go to. Make sure they understand their options." A bitter taste filled Collins's mouth like old pennies and regret. He knew those shelters were already overcrowded, with waiting lists stretching for months. The veterans in the tunnel had tried them before, only to face closed doors and empty promises. "Questions?" Harper looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the gathered officers. No one raised their hand. "Good. Dismissed." As chairs scraped against the floor and officers began filing out, discussing weekend plans and lunch breaks, Detective Mason caught Collins's arm. "Hey, got a minute?" They moved to a quiet corner near the water cooler where the steady drip of water matched Collins's mounting anxiety. Mason's familiar face was creased with concern, the worry lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "You've been acting different, Henry. What's going on?" Collins forced his shoulders to relax, though the tension refused to leave his neck. "Just tired," he said, avoiding Mason's searching gaze like a guilty man. "Retirement's coming up. Got a lot on my mind." "That's not it." Mason lowered his voice, leaning in closer. "I've known you too long. Something's eating at you. I can see it in your eyes." "Really, I'm fine." Collins managed a weak smile that felt more like a grimace. "Just need some rest, that's all." Mason didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. He gave Collins' shoulder a squeeze before walking away, his footsteps echoing in the bustling precinct. Back at his desk, Collins stared at the eviction notice timeline until the words blurred together. 2 days. That's all the time Ava and the veterans had left. His stomach churned as he thought about Curtis, about all of them being dragged out of their makeshift home, their dignity stripped away along with their shelter. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of paperwork and hollow conversations. Before he knew it, he was sitting in his dark apartment, his phone heavy in his hand like a brick. He pulled up Ava's number. He'd gotten it from her school records, telling himself it was just in case of emergency, though the guilt of that small violation still nagged at him. His thumb hovered over the call button, trembling slightly. What would he even say? Another warning wouldn't help. They needed more than words now. They needed action. Colin set the phone down and grabbed his keys from the counter. The metal felt cold in his palm as he headed for the door, his decision made in the quiet of his conscience. The night air hung heavy with moisture as Colin sat in his patrol car, watching the empty street. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel while he waited, streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Every few minutes he checked his watch, knowing Ava's usual schedule by heart now. The gentle hum of his idling engine and distant traffic were the only sounds breaking the stillness. Right on time, a familiar figure appeared at the corner. Ava's shoulders hunched under her backpack's weight as she trudged along the sidewalk, her worn sneakers scuffing against the concrete. Colin stepped out of his car, the door's creak breaking the evening silence. "Ava," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She stopped, turning slowly. The streetlight caught the exhaustion etched across her young face, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "What now?" Her voice carried that familiar edge of defiance, but he could hear the weariness underneath like sandpaper worn too thin. "I might have found something," Colin said, taking a careful step forward. "A warehouse just outside the city limits. It's been empty for months. Clean, dry, plenty of space." Ava's eyes narrowed. "And who's paying for that?" The skepticism in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Because if you haven't noticed, we're not exactly rolling in cash." She shifted uncomfortably, her hand tightening around her backpack strap. Collins shifted his weight, choosing his words carefully. "I know someone in real estate, an old friend who owes me a favor." He didn't mention the 3-hour phone call he'd made earlier, calling in every marker he had, or the promises he'd had to make. "Right." Ava adjusted her backpack strap, wincing slightly as it dug into her shoulder. "And what's the catch?" "No catch. It's temporary, but it's better than nothing. At least let me show you the place." He tried to keep his voice steady, reassuring. She studied him for a long moment, streetlight casting half her face in shadow. The weight of responsibility seemed to press down on her narrow shoulders as she considered his offer, aging her beyond her years. "The others won't like it," she said finally. "They don't trust easily, especially cops." Her fingers fidgeted with a loose thread on her jacket. "I know." Collins took another step closer, gravel crunching under his boots. "But they trust you, and right now, we're running out of options." Ava's gaze dropped to the ground, then lifted again. Something had shifted in her expression, a crack in her usual wall of suspicion. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before my shift, I can pick you up here." She was quiet for so long that Collins thought she might refuse. Then she gave a slight nod, barely perceptible in the dim light. "Fine. But if this is some kind of trick—" "It's not," Collins assured her quickly. "I promise." Ava adjusted her backpack again and started walking away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street. This time, though, she didn't tell him to stay away or mind his own business. She just disappeared into the shadows, leaving Collins standing under the flickering streetlight, hoping he could actually pull this off. The weight of her tentative trust felt heavier than any burden he'd carried before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the warehouse's empty parking lot as Collins pulled up in his patrol car. Richard Bowen stood waiting, his expensive suit looking out of place against the building's weathered exterior. His polished leather shoes gleamed incongruously against the cracked asphalt. He extended his hand as Collins approached, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Sergeant Collins, good to see you." Bowen gestured toward the warehouse. "Shall we?" Inside, their footsteps echoed through the vast empty space. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The concrete floor was swept clean, and despite its age, the building seemed structurally sound. Collins could already picture how it could work. Sleeping areas sectioned off, a community space, maybe even a small kitchen. He could almost see Curtis helping to organize the veterans into their new home. "It's perfect," Collins said, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls. His heart raced with possibility. Bowen nodded, hands in his pockets. "Yes, well, about that." He cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "I'll need 3 months' deposit up front. Call it insurance." Collins felt his stomach drop. How much? When Bowen named the figure, Collins had to stop himself from wincing. It was more than he'd expected, a lot more. The number seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy and imposing. Back in his car, Collins started making calls, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed number after number. First to local churches, then to veteran support groups. Each conversation ended the same way. Sympathy, but no immediate help. By lunch, he was getting desperate, his throat tight with frustration. Finally, he did what he'd been avoiding. He called his bank. The savings he'd been putting aside for retirement would cover it, barely. His hands shook as he authorized the transfer, watching years of careful saving disappear in moments. That evening, he found Ava making her usual rounds near the tunnel entrance. Her eyes widened when he showed her the lease agreement, the paper crumpling slightly in her grip. "You actually did it?" She took the paper, reading it carefully. "This is real?" "It's real," Collins confirmed, watching hope bloom across her face. "We can start moving everyone tomorrow." For the first time since he'd met her, Ava's tough exterior cracked. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and something close to hope flickered across her face. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, trying to hide her emotion. "I'll tell Curtis and the others tonight. They won't believe it." Collins watched her hurry off, feeling better than he had in days. The weight of his depleted savings account seemed lighter somehow. Maybe this would work after all. The next morning, his phone rang just as he was getting ready for work, coffee cup halfway to his lips. Bowen's number flashed on the screen. "Collins," he answered. "The deal's off." Bowen's voice was clipped, professional. "I've been informed the property isn't suitable for residential use. I'll wire your deposit back today." Collins gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. "What are you talking about? We signed the lease yesterday." "The city has certain concerns. My hands are tied." A pause, filled with static and unspoken words. "I'm sorry, Sergeant." The line went dead. Collins stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, as the morning sun streamed through his kitchen window, casting cheerful patterns that seemed to mock him. The warehouse was gone. Their last hope had just disappeared, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Collins leaned against his car near the tunnel entrance. His heart felt like lead in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of what he was about to do. He'd rehearsed what to say a dozen times, pacing his apartment floor all night, but no words seemed right. When Ava appeared at the end of the alley, her steps quick and purposeful, her backpack slung over one shoulder, he could barely meet her eyes. "Is everything ready?" she asked, a hint of hope in her voice that made his guilt even worse. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her backpack, betraying her nervous excitement. Collins swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "Ava, I'm sorry. The deal. It fell through." Her face transformed in stages. First confusion, then understanding, and finally, a deep hurt that made her look much older than her years. The light in her eyes dimmed like a candle being slowly extinguished. "What do you mean, fell through?" "The owner backed out, the city pressured him, and—" "I actually thought you cared," she whispered, her voice cracking. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, the betrayal written clearly across her face. "I trusted you." "Ava, please, let me explain. I'm trying to find another way." "Stop." She held up her hand, trembling slightly. "Just stop." You're just like all the rest, making promises you can't keep." Before Collins could respond, the sharp wail of police sirens split the air, shattering the tension between them. Red and blue lights reflected off the brick walls of the alley, casting eerie shadows that danced like demons. Ava's eyes went wide with panic, all color draining from her face. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance, their tires sending loose gravel skittering across the pavement. Officers poured out, led by Lieutenant Harper himself, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. They moved with practiced efficiency, heading straight for the tunnel entrance, their boots echoing against the concrete. "Clear the area," Harper's voice boomed, bouncing off the alley walls. "This is now a restricted zone." Ava tried to run toward the tunnel, but Collins caught her arm, his fingers gentle but firm. "Don't make it worse," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. She yanked away from him, her eyes blazing with fury and betrayal. Worse? How could it be worse? Inside the tunnel, shouts and protests erupted like a sudden storm. Curtis emerged first, being roughly guided by 2 officers, his weathered hands cuffed behind his back. His face was a mask of fury and resignation, the face of a man who'd seen this coming but hoped against hope it wouldn't. "This is how you help veterans?" he shouted at no one in particular, his voice raw with emotion. "This is how you treat the people who served?" More officers emerged, escorting the other veterans. Some went quietly, heads down, shoulders slumped in defeat, while others struggled and argued, their voices mixing into a chorus of despair. One elderly man stumbled, his cane clattering to the ground, and Ava broke free from Collins, rushing to help him, her protective instincts taking over. "Leave them alone," she screamed, trying to push past an officer, her small frame vibrating with desperate energy. "They have nowhere else to go." The officer gently but firmly moved her aside, his face a practiced mask of professional detachment. "Step back, miss. This is official business." Collins stood frozen, his badge feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, burning against his chest. Every instinct told him to step in, to stop this madness. But he knew if he interfered, he'd lose his position, his pension, everything he'd worked for. And then he'd be no help to anyone. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical force. Ava turned to him, her face streaked with tears that caught the afternoon light. "Do something," she begged. "Please." But Collins remained rooted in place, watching as the veterans were led away, as their meager possessions were collected as evidence, as Ava's whole world crumbled before his eyes. His inaction felt like acid in his stomach, eating away at whatever was left of his self-respect. Lieutenant Harper approached him nodding professionally, satisfaction evident in his stride. "Good work tracking this location, Collins. We've been looking for this camp for months." Collins couldn't respond, the words stuck in his throat like thorns. He watched Ava sink to her knees in the alley, her shoulders shaking with sobs as Curtis and the others were loaded into police vehicles. The afternoon sun continued to shine, indifferent to the scene of heartbreak below, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward an uncertain future. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the chaotic scene. Officers swarmed the tunnel entrance like angry wasps, their boots echoing against concrete as they dragged out Curtis and the other veterans. The old soldier's face remained stoic, even as they roughly cuffed his hands behind his back, though Collins noticed the slight tremor in his weathered fingers. "Stop it, leave them alone." Ava's desperate screams pierced through the commotion. She tried to push past an officer, but he shoved her back hard. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, her palms scraping against the rough surface. Collins stood rooted to the spot, his chest tight. Everything seemed to move in slow motion, the veterans being forced into squad cars, belongings scattered across the ground like discarded memories, Ava's tears streaming down her face. His badge felt like it was burning through his chest, each heartbeat a reminder of his role in this nightmare. "You said you'd help," Ava's voice cracked as she turned to him, her eyes full of betrayal and fury. "You promised." The words hit him like physical blows, each one exposing the gulf between what he'd sworn to do and what was happening now. Mason appeared at Collins's side, speaking low and urgent. "Henry, don't do anything stupid. You interfere, you're done. 20 years on the force, gone. His friend's face was etched with concern, but Collins barely registered it. Collins watched as Curtis was pushed into the back of a cruiser. The old veteran's eyes met his for a moment, tired, resigned, but somehow still dignified, like a fallen king maintaining his grace. In that instant, Collins heard his late wife Ellen's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. The law isn't perfect, but you can choose to do what's right. His badge had never felt heavier. Taking a deep breath that seemed to fill his entire body, Collins stepped forward. "Stop!" His voice rang out across the alley, bouncing off the brick walls. "This isn't right." The officers paused, turning to stare at him like he'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Lieutenant Harper's face darkened like an approaching storm. "Collins, stand down." "No." Collins moved to stand between the officers and the remaining veterans, his shoulders squared and stance firm. "These men served our country. They deserve better than this." "These are our orders," Harper growled, his jaw clenching. "Step aside." "Orders?" Collins laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in his throat. "Is that what we're calling cruelty now?" He noticed news cameras appearing at the entrance to the alley, their lenses focused on the confrontation like hungry eyes. Mason grabbed his arm, fingers digging in. "Henry, think about what you're doing." "I am thinking." Collins shrugged off his friend's hand. "For the first time in years, I'm really thinking." He turned to face his fellow officers, seeing the uncertainty in some of their faces. "We took an oath to protect and serve. Who exactly are we protecting by throwing veterans onto the street?" Ava stood frozen, watching him with wide eyes. The anger in her face had been replaced by something else, surprise, and maybe a glimmer of respect. Behind her, the remaining veterans huddled together, their faces a mixture of hope and disbelief. Collins knew in that moment that his career was over. 20 years of service, ending right here in this dirty alley. But as he looked at Ava, at Curtis in the police car, at the other veterans watching him with cautious hope, he realized it might be worth it. Some prices were worth paying for doing what was right. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of City Hall as Collins walked into Mayor Linda Garvey's office. The polished mahogany desk and pristine decorations seemed to mock the gritty reality of the streets below, where people struggled just to survive another day. Detective Mason stood quietly in the corner, his face unreadable, hands clasped behind his back. Mayor Garvey sat rigid behind her desk, a newspaper spread out before her. The headline screamed, "Officer defies department, stands up for homeless veterans." Her perfectly pressed suit and severe expression matched the cold formality of the room. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her voice was ice cold. "The embarrassment you've brought to this city? The phone has been ringing off the hook all morning." Collins placed his badge on her desk without a word. The metal made a soft thud against the wood, a sound that seemed to echo in the tense silence. 20 years of service, she continued. Thrown away for what? A group of vagrants? You had such a promising career ahead of you." "Those vagrants are veterans who served this country," Collins replied calmly, his voice steady and determined. "But I don't expect you to understand that. You've never had to sleep on the streets." The mayor's perfectly manicured nails drummed against her desk. "Officer Collins, you are officially relieved of duty for insubordination and misconduct. Detective Mason is here as witness. I hope you realize what this means for your pension." Collins nodded, feeling lighter than he had in years, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "That's fine. I knew what I was doing when I made my choice." As he turned to leave, Mason stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Hell of a way to retire," he muttered, just loud enough for Collins to hear. There was something in his old friend's voice, not quite approval but understanding, maybe even a hint of admiration. Instead of heading home, Collins drove straight to the city shelter where Curtis and the others had been taken. The building was a stark concrete block, its windows covered in metal mesh, looking more like a prison than a place of refuge. News vans were already parked outside, reporters doing their morning broadcasts. their cameras and microphones ready to capture the unfolding story. He spotted Ava sitting on the shelter steps, her oversized backpack at her feet, fingers nervously playing with the frayed straps. When she saw him approach, she stood up slowly. Her eyes fell to his chest where his badge used to be, taking in the empty space. "You really did it," she said softly, a mix of surprise and something else in her voice. Respect, maybe even trust. Collins straightened his shoulders. "Not done yet. We're going to get them out. All of them." For the first time since they'd met, Ava looked at him without anger or suspicion. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. They weren't cop and troublemaker anymore, just two people trying to help those who needed it most, united in a cause bigger than themselves. The autumn sun beat down on the construction site as Collins walked through the chain-link gate, the metal creaking on its hinges. The steady rhythm of hammers and saws filled the air, along with the calls of volunteers coordinating their efforts, their voices carrying across the lot with enthusiasm and purpose. The skeleton of the new shelter was already taking shape, metal beams reaching toward the sky, fresh wooden frames marking out rooms and corridors, the foundation solid beneath it all. Ava stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she squinted against the sunlight. She looked different now, still determined, but with a new confidence in her stance, a lightness in her movements that hadn't been there before. She pointed toward a stack of lumber, directing two volunteers who waited attentively for her instructions. "Those need to go to the East Wing. We're starting the framework there this afternoon, and make sure to keep them covered if it looks like rain." Curtis Banks worked nearby, his weathered hands steady as he measured and marked boards with practiced precision. Sweat glistened on his forehead as he worked, but his eyes were clear and focused. The other veterans from the tunnel were there too, each finding their place in the rebuilding effort, their faces showing purpose rather than desperation now. The charges against them had been dropped after the public outcry, and now they were helping create their own future, one nail and board at a time. Collins hung back, hands stuffed in his pockets, watching the activity with uncertain eyes. Without his badge, without his uniform, he felt oddly exposed, like a fish out of water. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of media interviews, community meetings, and sleepless nights spent wondering if he'd made the right choice. The story had caught fire. The cop who stood up against the system, who chose conscience over career. Donations had poured in enough to fund this new shelter and then some. But now, watching everyone work with such purpose, he felt lost, adrift in this new world he'd helped create. What was his role here? What could an ex-cop contribute to this new chapter when he'd spent so long being part of the problem? Ava spotted him and walked over, her boots kicking up dust with each determined step. She studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, then thrust a clipboard into his hands with decisive authority. "We need you to coordinate with the electrical contractors. They're coming at 2, and someone needs to walk them through the layout. The wiring has to be perfect." Collins blinked at the clipboard, scanning the unfamiliar technical drawings. "I don't know anything about construction. This isn't exactly what they taught at the academy." "But you know how to organize people," Ava said firmly, crossing her arms. "You know how to make things happen. That's what we need right now. Someone who can keep all the pieces moving together." Curtis looked up from his work and gave Collins a nod, his eyes holding steady. The gesture carried weight, acceptance, respect, maybe even forgiveness for all that had come before. Ava wasn't finished. She gestured at the bustling site around them, her voice passionate. "This isn't just about building walls," she said. "It's about building something that lasts, something that matters, something my dad would have been proud of." She gestured at the bustling site around them, where every person moved with determination. "Everyone here has a part to play, including you." Collins looked down at the clipboard, then back at the rising framework of the shelter, taking in the progress they'd already made. He thought about his badge, sitting in a drawer at home, gathering dust. He'd thought turning it in would be the end of something, a final chapter closing. Maybe it was just the beginning of a better story. He set the clipboard aside and picked up a hammer from a nearby toolbox. The weight felt good in his hand, Different from his service weapon, but solid, real, honest. "Show me where to start," he said, feeling something shift inside him, something like hope taking root. Ava smiled. A real smile. Perhaps the first one he'd seen from her, warming her entire face. "Follow me," she said, leading him toward the growing shelter that was already starting to feel like home, a place where second chances were built one day at a time. The construction site stood silent under a blanket of stars, the skeletal framework casting long shadows in the moonlight. Colin's footsteps echoed softly as he walked through the unfinished corridors, his hand trailing along the rough wooden beams. The day's work was done, but he couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. The smell of fresh-cut lumber and drying concrete hung in the air, reminding him of new beginnings. He paused at a half-finished wall, remembering the chaos of the eviction, the shouts, the tears, the look of betrayal in Ava's eyes. The veterans' faces haunted him too, men who'd served their country only to be cast aside. How many times had he been on the other side of that scene? How many people had he forced from their makeshift homes, all in the name of following orders? The memory of his wife Ellen floated back to him, clear as yesterday. They'd been sitting on their front porch, the evening air warm and sweet with the scent of her prized gardenias. "Why did you become a cop, Henry?" she'd asked, her eyes gentle but searching. He'd told her about wanting to protect people, to make a difference. She'd smiled that knowing smile of hers, the one that always saw right through him. "Then don't ever forget that's the real job. Not following rules, but helping people." His throat tightened. He'd lost sight of that somewhere along the way, gotten too comfortable with just following orders. The weight of those years pressed down on him now. All the times he'd looked the other way, all the people he'd failed to really see. Each face, each story he'd ignored, felt like another brick on his conscience. His phone buzzed. Another news alert. Disgraced officer or unlikely hero. The cop who took a stand. The article was spreading online like wildfire, comments divided between praising his courage and condemning his betrayal. Some called him a champion of the forgotten. Others branded him a traitor to the badge. "They're calling you a traitor," Mason's voice cut through the darkness. Collins turned to see his old friend standing there, phone in hand, illuminated by its glow. The shadows couldn't hide the concern etched on Mason's face. "Let them," Collins replied, his voice steady. The words that once would have wounded him now felt meaningless. Mason stepped closer, studying the construction site. His boots crunched on sawdust as he moved. "You know the system isn't done coming for you, right? There's talk about investigating your past cases, looking for dirt." Collins nodded, running his hand over the unfinished wall again. The rough wood felt solid, real. "I know." "You gave up everything," Mason said, shaking his head. "Your badge, your pension." "No," Collins interrupted, looking up at the framework of what would soon be a home for people who desperately needed one. "I finally found something worth fighting for." Mason pulled out a flask and offered it to Collins. The metal gleamed dully in the darkness. "You're either the bravest or the craziest cop I've ever known." "Not a cop anymore," Collins reminded him, taking a small sip before handing the flask back. The whiskey burned warm in his chest. The moonlight filtered through the beams above them, creating patterns on the dirt floor like nature's own stained glass. Everything he'd worked for was gone. His career, his reputation, his security. But standing here in this unfinished shelter that represented a new beginning for so many, Collins felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. He wasn't lost anymore. For the first time since Ellen died, he knew exactly where he belonged. In helping others find their home, he'd finally found his own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Collins pulled up in his old pickup truck. The shelter was taking shape, wooden frames rising from concrete foundations, the promise of safety slowly becoming reality. The fresh scent of sawdust and newly cut lumber filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of turned soil. But as he stepped out of his vehicle, he noticed Curtis Banks standing alone, staring at the half-built structure with a hard expression on his weathered face, his hands stuffed deep in his jacket pockets. Collins took a deep breath and walked over, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The veteran's posture stiffened as he approached, but he didn't move away, his shoulders squared like he was preparing for battle. "You're the reason I got arrested," Curtis muttered, his voice rough with resentment. He kept his eyes fixed on the building, refusing to look at Collins directly, the morning breeze ruffling his gray-streaked hair. Collins didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he nodded slowly, accepting the truth of those words. "And I'll be the reason you have a place to stay," he replied, letting the weight of the promise hang in the air between them. The tension hung thick between them until Ava's voice cut through it. She appeared from behind a stack of lumber, clipboard in hand, looking more confident than Collins had ever seen her. Her work boots were covered in dust and her determined expression showed she meant business. "We need help," she said simply, looking between the two men. "You in or not?" Her direct approach left no room for their lingering animosity. Curtis shifted his weight, jaw clenched. His eyes darted from Ava to Collins and back to the shelter, while his fingers drummed restlessly against his thigh. After what felt like an eternity, he gave a short nod. Collins reached into his truck and pulled out a toolbox and a mop. "You'll work for it," he said, holding them out to Curtis. "This isn't charity, it's a job." The metal toolbox gleamed in the morning light, its scratched surface telling stories of countless projects. A hint of a smirk crossed Curtis's face as he took the items, his calloused hands wrapping firmly around the handles. "Wouldn't want it any other way," he said, his voice still gruff but with less edge than before. Ava watched the exchange with careful eyes before turning back to her clipboard, making quick notes with practiced efficiency. She'd grown into her role quickly, organizing volunteers and managing supplies with a natural authority that seemed to surprise even her. Her father would have been proud. Curtis moved toward the building, tools in hand, his military training evident in his precise movements. His back was straight, his stride purposeful, as if he was falling back into a familiar routine. Collins watched him go, feeling a mix of respect and regret. The man had served his country only to be thrown away by the system, the same system Collins had upheld for so many years. Around them, the construction site buzzed with activity. Volunteers carried lumber, hammered nails, and measured walls. The steady rhythm of work filled the air with hope. What had started as a desperate attempt to help a group of forgotten veterans was growing into something bigger, something that might actually make a difference. The skeleton of the building stood as a testament to what they could achieve together. For the first time in weeks, Collins felt like he was making real progress, not just building walls and roof, but rebuilding trust, one small gesture at a time. The morning sun continued to climb, promising a new day of possibilities. The morning air was crisp as Collins helped Curtis stack lumber near the shelter's entrance. The building was nearly complete, fresh paint gleaming in the sunlight, new windows reflecting the sky. They'd accomplished so much in such a short time, transforming what had been a derelict warehouse into something that promised hope and safety. Then he saw the city inspector, dressed in a pressed gray suit that seemed out of place among the construction equipment and sawdust. The man moved with deliberate steps, his face set in a mask of bureaucratic indifference, pulling a bright orange notice from his briefcase. "Hey," Collins called out, dropping a piece of lumber with a thud, but the inspector merely glanced his way before pinning the notice to the construction fence with quick, practiced movements. Ava emerged from inside the shelter, wiping paint from her hands with a rag, her face darkening as she read the bold letters. "Cease and desist order." The morning sun caught the fresh paint behind her, making the contrast between their hopes and this setback even starker. "They're trying to shut us down before we even open," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Her hands balled into fists at her sides, knuckles white with tension. The rag fell forgotten to the ground. Collins strode over to the inspector, who was already turning to leave, gravel crunching under his feet. "What's this about?" The inspector adjusted his tie, looking bored as if he'd done this 100 times before. "This area isn't zoned for residential facilities. Orders from the city." He shrugged as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, his indifference a carefully crafted shield. "We have people counting on this place," Collins argued, gesturing to the nearly finished building behind him. But the inspector was already walking away, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, each step a small insult. Curtis came to stand beside them, sawdust coating his worn work gloves, his expression grim. "They're not gonna stop," he said, crossing his arms. "The city doesn't want this place to exist. Never did." His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this story play out before, thick with years of disappointment. Ava yanked the notice off the fence, crumpling it in her hands. "All this work," she said, gesturing to the nearly finished shelter, where fresh paint and new windows stood as testimony to their efforts. "Everything we've built, they think they can just take it away with a piece of paper?" Collins watched the inspector's retreating form, feeling the familiar anger rise in his chest. He'd seen this tactic before. When direct force didn't work, bureaucracy became the weapon of choice. They wouldn't send police this time. They'd send lawyers and paperwork instead, drowning them in red tape and regulations. "We fight back," Collins said firmly, turning to face Ava. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site, but his resolve cast an even longer one. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance, eyes burning with determination. "Then let's go to war." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of intent that transformed their small construction site into a battlefield. Not with guns or badges this time, but with permits and petitions and the sheer force of their determination. The crumpled notice lay at their feet, just another obstacle to overcome. The morning sun cast long shadows across City Hall's steps as protesters gathered, their handmade signs bobbing in the crisp air. "Homes not hate" and "Veterans deserve better" were written in bold letters against cardboard backgrounds, some decorated with American flags and military symbols. News vans lined the street, cameras already rolling, while reporters huddled together checking their equipment and phones. Collins stood at the bottom of the steps watching as more people arrived. He hadn't expected such a turnout. There must have been at least 200 people now. Beside him, Ava fidgeted with the microphone in her hands, her eyes scanning the growing crowd, counting familiar faces from the tunnel community. "Nervous?" he asked, noticing how she kept adjusting her jacket collar. She shook her head, jaw clenched tight. "Just angry." From her office window high above, Mayor Linda Garvey watched the scene unfold, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her desk. Local news channels were already broadcasting live feeds of the protest, and her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from concerned council members. Ava stepped forward, her hands steady now as she raised the microphone. The crowd fell quiet, a hush spreading from front to back like a wave. "This isn't just about a shelter," she began, her voice clear and strong, carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights. "It's about human lives. These are people who served our country, who protected us. And now, when they need help, the city wants to turn its back on them. We won't let that happen." The crowd responded with cheers and raised fists. Camera flashes lit up the morning air, creating a storm of light against the granite building. Collins moved to stand beside her, taking the microphone when she offered it. His police badge, which he'd worn proudly for so long, felt heavy in his pocket. "I wore a badge for 30 years, he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I thought I was protecting people, but the city has turned its back on its people. We won't do the same. Not today, not ever." In her office, Mayor Garvey's face tightened with fury as she watched the broadcast, her carefully maintained composure cracking. She snatched up her phone, barking orders to her staff, demanding immediate action. News reporters pushed forward, shoving microphones toward Ava and Collins, their questions overlapping in an eager chorus. "Miss Johnson, what's your response to the zoning violations?" "Officer Collins, do you regret your actions?" "What about the safety concerns?" But before either could answer, Ava turned to Collins, her voice low enough that only he could hear, filled with a mix of hope and uncertainty. "What happens now?" Collins looked directly at the wall of cameras, his jaw set with determination. Years of following orders giving way to something stronger: conviction. Now we make them listen. The morning sun painted the shelter's freshly painted walls in warm golden light. A small crowd had gathered outside: veterans, volunteers, and curious onlookers. Curtis Banks stood at the entrance, his weathered face bearing an unusual smile as he welcomed the first residents inside. Ava and Collins watched from near the dining area, where steam rose from large pots of hot soup and fresh bread filled baskets on the tables. "Never thought we'd actually get here," Ava said, adjusting the name tags on the tables. The first group of veterans filed in, some carrying small bags of belongings, others just themselves. Curtis guided them to the tables with a gentle authority that came from shared experience. Ava moved to the serving station, ladling soup into bowls while Curtis helped people find seats. The atmosphere was thick with emotion, relief, gratitude, and something that felt like hope. Colin stayed back, leaning against the wall. This wasn't his moment. He watched as Ava worked the room, checking on everyone, making sure each person had enough to eat. She moved with confidence now, no longer the exhausted girl he'd first noticed struggling with her backpack. Camera flashes punctuated the scene as local reporters documented the shelter's opening. Their presence felt like insurance. The city couldn't easily shut down something so public now. One elderly veteran caught Collins' eye. The man sat alone, staring at his bowl of soup as if it were made of gold. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the spoon to his mouth. After the initial rush settled, Ava made her way back to where Collins stood. She slid down the wall to sit beside him, letting out a long breath. "We did it," she said simply. Collins nodded, watching as more people filtered through the doors, each one finding a place at the tables, each one finally having somewhere to belong. The shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as people streamed through the doors. The evening air was thick with tension and desperation. Ava stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, trying to maintain some semblance of order as families, elderly veterans, and individuals seeking refuge filed in. "Name and any immediate medical needs?" she asked repeatedly, her voice growing hoarse. In the kitchen, Curtis worked frantically, stirring massive pots of soup while volunteers rushed back and forth with trays of bread and water. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he called out, "We're running low on bowls." Collins moved through the chaos, watching as the situation grew more complex by the minute. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair needed help getting to the bathroom. A mother with 3 small children couldn't find enough space to set up their bedding. The medical station was overwhelmed with people needing basic care. "We've got diabetics who need insulin," someone shouted from across the room. "The soup's almost gone and we've still got 30 people waiting," Curtis called out, his voice strained. Collins saw Ava's shoulders tense as she tried to manage the mounting crisis. Her earlier confidence was cracking under the pressure of real-world logistics. "We can't keep up with this, not like this," Curtis said, wiping his brow with his sleeve as he looked at the seemingly endless line for food. Taking a deep breath, Collins stepped forward. Years of police work had taught him how to handle chaos. He grabbed a chair, stood on it, and called out in his commanding voice, "Everyone, listen up." The room quieted slightly. "If you have children or are elderly, please move to the front of the line. Medical needs, go to the left wall. Everyone else form 3 lines, 1 for food, 1 for bedding, 1 for registration." People began to move, the chaos slowly transforming into organized lines. Collins helped direct traffic, ensuring the most vulnerable got immediate attention. Ava caught his eye across the room, relief washing over her exhausted face. She'd been trying to be everything to everyone, and it was breaking her down. Curtis managed to stretch the soup by adding more water and vegetables, feeding everyone who came through the line. The kitchen volunteers fell into a rhythm, guided by his experienced hand. Hours passed in a blur of activity. Collins helped set up beds, carried supplies, and mediated minor disputes. His back ached, but he kept moving. This wasn't like any job he'd ever had. It was harder, more immediate, more real. By midnight, the shelter had finally settled. People were sleeping on cots and mats, their breathing creating a gentle symphony of survival. Collins leaned against the wall, his shirt soaked with sweat, his muscles screaming from the effort. Ava made her way over to him, her own exhaustion evident in every step. She slid down the wall to sit beside him, both of them watching the sleeping faces in the shelter. "This is just the beginning, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Collins nodded, too tired to speak. "Yeah, but it's a start." The morning sun filtered through the shelter's windows, casting long shadows across the desk where Collins sat. His muscles ached from the previous night's work, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his exhaustion. The rhythmic sound of construction outside provided a steady backdrop to the morning's relative calm. Ava was organizing paperwork nearby, dark circles under her eyes, testament to the challenging night they'd endured. The front door chimed as a local reporter stepped in, clutching several copies of the morning paper. "Thought you might want to see this," the reporter said, handing one to Ava. The headline jumped off the page: "Disgraced Officer Helps Build Shelter for Homeless. City Responds." Ava's hands tightened on the paper as she read, her knuckles turning white. The article was brutal, filled with quotes from city officials condemning Collins and their operation. "Former Officer Collins' actions reflect poorly on our entire police force," Mayor Garvey was quoted saying. "This shelter is nothing more than a flawed experiment led by someone who turned his back on law and order. This is garbage." Ava slammed the paper down on the desk. "They're trying to make you look like some kind of criminal. After everything you've done." Collins picked up the paper, his expression unchanging as he scanned the words. "I've been through worse," he said quietly, setting it aside. "But they're lying about you about all of this." Ava gestured around the shelter. "They're making it sound like we're running some kind of—" The phone rang, interrupting her tirade. Ava answered it, her angry expression slowly shifting to surprise. "Yes, we do need blankets. And you want to donate how many?" As she took notes, another call came in on the second line. Then another. People were reaching out, offering supplies, volunteering their time, asking how they could help. "The article," Collins said, watching Ava juggle the calls. "It's backfiring on them." A local business owner walked in, carrying boxes of toiletries. "Saw the paper this morning," he said, setting them down. "Figured you could use these." More people arrived throughout the morning, each mentioning the article, each offering support. The city's attempt to discredit them had only made their cause more visible. Ava looked at Collins, who was helping unload donations. "They want to shut us down," she said firmly, "but we're not going anywhere." Collins nodded, watching as more community members arrived with supplies. The city's hit piece had become their unexpected ally, turning their small shelter into a symbol of resistance against an uncaring system. The winter storm howled through the city streets, turning everything white with thick, heavy snow. Outside the shelter, a line of people huddled together, their breath visible in the freezing air. Collins stood at the entrance, his heart heavy as he watched more people trudge through the snowdrifts toward them. Inside, the shelter was already packed. Every available space had been converted into sleeping areas. People sat shoulder to shoulder on chairs, while others curled up on thin mats on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of wet clothes and anxiety. "We're running out of blankets," Ava called out, rushing past with an armful of supplies. Her face was flushed from constant movement, her eyes wide with worry. "And the soup kitchen's almost empty." Curtis worked tirelessly in the kitchen, stirring massive pots of soup. "Making it stretch as much as I can," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "But we're gonna need more soon." Suddenly, the front door burst open. Two men carried in a third, his body limp and skin pale blue from the cold. "Found him behind the dumpster," one of them shouted. "He's not moving." Curtis dropped his ladle and rushed over. "Get him to the back room." He took charge immediately, his military training kicking in. Collins helped them carry the unconscious man to their makeshift medical area. Working quickly, they wrapped him in emergency blankets. Curtis checked his vital signs while Collins rubbed the man's hands, trying to warm them. After several tense minutes, color returned to the man's face and his eyes fluttered open. "That's the third one today," Curtis said quietly to Collins. "We can't keep doing this. We're not equipped for medical emergencies." Back in the main room, Ava was trying to find space for a family with 3 small children. The kids huddled close to their mother, their clothes wet from the snow. "We're out of beds," Ava told Collins, her voice cracking with frustration. "We're out of everything. People keep coming and we can't turn them away in this weather." Collins surveyed the crowded room. Every corner was filled, every resource stretched to its limit. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and more people would surely come seeking shelter from the brutal cold. "We need to do something," Collins said, running a hand through his gray hair. "We can't keep up with this. We need more room, more help." Ava looked at him, determination burning in her tired eyes. "We'll find a way." The morning sun glinted off patches of melting snow as Collins stood outside the shelter, watching people come and go. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered in the tired faces of volunteers and the growing needs of those seeking help. He rubbed his hands together against the lingering cold, his breath visible in the crisp air. Detective Mason's familiar figure appeared, walking purposefully toward the shelter. His police uniform looked out of place among the volunteers and homeless individuals milling about. Some people tensed at the sight of his badge, but Collins noticed Mason had left his usual stern expression behind. "Quite an operation you've got here," Mason said, stopping beside Collins. His eyes scanned the bustling activity. Volunteers carrying supplies, people lining up for breakfast, others helping to clear the remaining snow from the entrance. Collins nodded, not taking his eyes off the scene before him. "We're making it work. Barely." Mason shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say. "Listen, Henry. I came to warn you. The city's getting ready to move against you again." Collins turned to face his old friend, his jaw tightening. "What now?" "They're going the legal route this time. Fire safety violations, health code infractions, anything they can use to shut you down through official channels." Mason's voice was low, meant only for Collins's ears. "They're building a case and they're being thorough about it." Collins's fists clenched at his sides. "They'll do anything to tear this down, won't they?" His voice was rough with anger. "We're helping people here, Mason, real people, and they just want to throw them back out on the streets." Mason glanced around before continuing. "There's something else you should know. Not everyone in the department agrees with what they're doing. Some of us, well, we see what you're trying to accomplish here." Collins looked sharply at his former colleague. Mason met his gaze steadily. "You've got more people on your side than you think," Mason continued. "I can't be obvious about it, but I can keep you informed. Maybe help you stay ahead of their moves." Collins studied his old friend's face, seeing the sincerity there. After a moment, he let out a heavy sigh. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Mason nodded slowly. "Yeah," he replied quietly. "But it's a fight worth having." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Ava directed volunteers unloading a truck of donated supplies. The morning bustle continued around them, each person focused on their tasks, unaware of the new threat looming over their sanctuary. Collins sat in a quiet corner of the shelter, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The winter chill still lingered in the air, but inside the shelter buzzed with activity. Volunteers moved back and forth, serving meals and organizing supplies, while new arrivals huddled near the heaters, grateful for warmth. Ava approached, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion. Her hands clutched a thick stack of papers, and her expression carried that familiar mix of determination and worry that Collins had come to know well. "We need to open another shelter," she said without preamble, dropping the papers on his makeshift desk. Collins looked up, his pen hovering over a form. "What?" "I found a place," Ava continued, spreading out several printed photos. "It's on the east side of town. The rent is cheaper than what we're paying here, but it needs work." Collins leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. "Ava, we're barely keeping this place afloat. The city's already looking for ways to shut us down. Opening another location." "We don't have a choice," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Look around. We're turning people away every night. Last week, a family with 3 kids had to sleep in their car because we didn't have space." Curtis appeared beside them, wiping his hands on his apron. He'd been managing the kitchen all morning, but his ears had caught their conversation. "She's right, Collins. We're packed to the rafters here. People are sleeping in hallways." Collins stood up, pacing the small space. If we spread ourselves too thin, we risk losing everything. The city's just waiting for us to make a mistake. If we don't do this, we're going to lose more people, Ava insisted, her voice cracking slightly. We need to act now. Winter isn't over yet. Curtis nodded, crossing his arms. I've got contacts, other vets who can help with the repairs. We can make it work if we all pitch in. Collins studied the photos again. The building was rough around the edges, but he could see the potential. Still, the risks were enormous. They'd struggled for weeks to establish proper procedures at this shelter, and their resources were already stretched paper thin. Look, Ava said softly. I know it's scary, but we didn't start this because it was easy. We did it because it was necessary. Collins picked up one of the photos, examining it closely. The building had good bones, despite its worn appearance. It was closer to the industrial district, where many of the homeless camps used to be. We'll do it, Collins said finally, his tone firm. Ava's face broke into a relieved smile. We won't fail. They gathered around the desk, starting to plan. Curtis pulled up a chair, already listing potential volunteers and supplies they'd need. Ava spread out more papers, building specs, cost estimates, and renovation plans. The shelter around them continued its daily rhythm. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the murmur of voices, the squeaking of cots as people settled in for rest. It was a reminder of why they were taking this risk in the first place. Collins's phone buzzed as he stepped out of the shelter into the crisp afternoon air. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in months. His stomach tightened as he answered. Henry Collins speaking. The voice on the other end was gentle, hesitant. Henry, it's Sarah, Jimmy's wife. Collins froze mid-step. Mason, who had been walking beside him, noticed his sudden stillness. It's Jimmy, Sarah's voice cracked. He had a heart attack this morning. The doctors couldn't. She couldn't finish. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Collins gripped the railing beside him, his knuckles turning white. Jimmy O'Connor had been his partner for 15 years before Collins moved to a different precinct. They'd shared countless cups of coffee, watched each other's backs, celebrated birthdays and promotions together. I'm so sorry, Sarah, Collins managed, his voice rough. When's the service? Mason stepped closer, concern etched on his face. He could read the grief in Collins's expression. After hanging up, Collins stood silent for a long moment. The shelter's sounds faded into the background. The chatter, the clanking of dishes, the hum of activity. All of it seemed distant now. Jimmy O'Connor's gone, Collins said finally. Heart attack. Mason's hand found Collins's shoulder, squeezing gently. I know you were close. Collins stared at the ground, memories flooding back. Jimmy had been there through everything. Collins' wife's funeral, the tough cases, the long nights. He'd been the kind of cop Collins had always tried to be. Fair, honest, dedicated. We hadn't spoken since... Collins trailed off. Since he'd been fired, since he'd chosen to fight the system they'd both served for so long. He understood, Henry, Mason said quietly. He might not have agreed, but he understood. The funeral was held 3 days later. Collins stood at the back of the crowd, watching as officers in dress uniforms filed past the casket. Some turned their backs when they saw him, others nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of respect. Jimmy's casket sat draped with the American flag, a testament to his years of service. Collins thought about all the times they'd talked about making a difference, about serving the community. Had they really served, or had they just been following orders? Mason appeared beside him, also in civilian clothes. You were right to fight, Henry. Collins watched another group of officers pass by, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. I should have done it sooner. Ava burst into the shelter's makeshift office, her face tight with frustration. Papers scattered across her desk as she dropped a heavy folder. We're not going to make it. The second shelter is nowhere near ready. Collins looked up from his laptop, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. The past week had been brutal. Endless permit applications, mounting bills, and a constant stream of new arrivals seeking help. "We just need a little more time," Collins said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can hold on." "Hold on?" Ava's voice cracked. "How much longer can we hold on?" "The city is coming for us, and we're running out of space and resources." She gestured toward the main room where cots lined every available space. "We're turning people away every night." The door slammed open as Curtis stormed in, his face dark with anger. He threw down a stack of papers, sending them sliding across the desk. "This isn't sustainable. You're killing yourself trying to fix a broken system." "Curtis," Collins started, but Curtis cut him off. "No, look at us. Look at Ava. She hasn't slept in days. The kitchen can barely keep up with meals. And now we're trying to open a second location?" Curtis ran a hand over his face. "We bit off more than we can chew." "What choice do we have?" Ava shot back, her exhaustion giving way to anger. "Should we just let people freeze on the streets?" "Maybe we should have thought this through better," Curtis countered. "Maybe we should have waited until we had more support, more resources." "There was no time to wait," Ava's voice rose. "People needed help now." "And what happens when we collapse under all this pressure?" Curtis demanded. "What happens to all these people then?" Collins watched as the argument escalated, seeing weeks of stress and exhaustion finally boiling over. The weight of everything, Jimmy's death, the city's pressure, the endless needs of the shelter, seemed to press down on his shoulders. Without a word, he stepped outside into the cold air. The shelter loomed before him, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Inside, he could hear the sounds of life, people talking, children laughing, pots clanking in the kitchen. All of it felt so fragile suddenly, like a house of cards ready to topple. Taking a deep breath, Collins turned and walked back inside. The arguing voices from the office grew louder with each step. They needed to find a way through this, or everything they'd built would crumble. The morning sun filtered through the shelter's windows as Collins, Ava, and Curtis gathered around a worn table in the office. Coffee cups steamed in front of them, a peace offering after last night's heated arguments. The tension still lingered in the air, but there was something else too, a shared determination to move forward. Collins cleared his throat, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "We need to talk about where we go from here. Really talk." Ava slumped in her chair, exhaustion written across her face. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to fail these people, but I don't know how much longer I can keep pushing like this." Curtis shifted in his seat, his earlier anger softening. "We're all scared," he said, meeting Ava's eyes. "But if we keep fighting each other, we'll lose. And these people, they can't afford for us to lose." Collins nodded, pulling out a notebook. "Then let's figure this out. Together. What's working? What isn't?" For the next hour, they mapped out everything. The shelter's strengths, its weaknesses, where they were spreading themselves too thin. Ava pointed out the need for better volunteer coordination. Curtis suggested ways to streamline the kitchen operations. "Maybe we've been trying to do too much," Collins said, writing down their ideas. "We need to focus on what matters most. Shelter, food, basic medical care. Everything else comes second." Ava straightened in her chair, some of her old energy returning. "We could combine the administrative work for both shelters. One team handling everything." "And I know some veterans who could help with security," Curtis added. "They're looking for purpose. We can give them that." As the morning wore on, their plan took shape. They would unite the shelters under one management system with clear roles and responsibilities. No more overlap, no more confusion. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky. Collins, Ava, and Curtis stood together, looking out at the shelter floor where people were starting their day. "We've come this far," Collins said quietly. "Let's keep going." Ava and Curtis nodded, the weight of the past few days finally starting to lift. They had a plan now, and more importantly, they had each other. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings as Collins and Ava stood outside the second shelter. The building wasn't fancy, just a renovated warehouse with basic amenities. But to them, it was beautiful. People lined up at the entrance carrying what few possessions they owned, their faces a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Curtis stood at the door, clipboard in hand, greeting each person with a warmth that seemed to surprise even himself. "Welcome," he said to an elderly couple. "Let's get you settled in." His voice carried the authority of someone who had found his calling. "This is it," Ava said softly, her eyes taking in every detail. Pride and anxiety battled in her expression as she watched the line move forward. She had grown so much since those early days of sneaking supplies through the city. Now she stood tall, confident, directing volunteers with clear purpose. Collins watched her work, remembering the angry, defensive teenager who had once told him to stay out of her business. Now she moved through the crowd with grace and authority, making sure everyone knew where to go and what to expect. "Medical intake is to the right," she called out, pointing the way. "If you need immediate attention, please let one of our volunteers know." Her voice was steady, reassuring. People responded to her naturally, trusting her leadership without question. Curtis had transformed too. Gone was the bitter, suspicious veteran who had once warned Collins to stay away. In his place stood a man with purpose, helping others find their footing. He showed new arrivals to their beds, explained the shelter rules, and made sure everyone felt welcome. "We've got room for everyone," Curtis assured a worried mother with 2 small children. "Let's get you and your kids settled first." His gentle approach put them at ease immediately. The intake process moved smoothly, just as they had planned. Months of preparation, countless meetings, and endless revisions of their procedures were paying off. The 2 shelters, working in tandem, sharing resources and staff, created a system that actually worked. Collins stood back, watching it all unfold. He thought about his old badge, about the life he'd left behind. None of that seemed to matter anymore. This was what making a difference really looked like. Ava joined him after making sure everything was running smoothly. They stood together, watching as more people entered the shelter, finding hope within its walls. "You've done good, kid," Collins said quietly, seeing the shelter come alive with activity. Ava smiled, her eyes bright with pride. We did this. Together." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shelter's entrance as Collins sat on the weathered bench, watching people come and go. The steady stream of residents and volunteers had become a familiar sight, a rhythm he'd grown accustomed to over these past months. His badge and gun were long gone, but something else had taken their place, a sense of purpose that felt more real than anything he'd known in his years on the force. Inside, Ava moved with confidence through the shelter's corridors, clipboard in hand, checking supplies and talking with residents. She no longer looked to him for approval or guidance. The uncertain teenager who once struggled under the weight of her backpack had transformed into a capable leader, someone who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. Curtis worked nearby, helping a new resident settle in. His gruff exterior had softened, replaced by a patient understanding that came from shared experience. "You'll be all right here," Collins heard him say to the newcomer. "We take care of our own." The community had rallied around them. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers showed up regularly, and even some of Collins's old colleagues from the force secretly supported their work. The mayor's attempts to shut them down had backfired, turning public opinion in their favor. Collins pulled out his old roadmap, the one he'd kept folded in his desk drawer for years, marking places he'd always wanted to see. The edges were worn, the creases deep from years of dreaming. He'd made a promise to himself long ago, before the badge became his whole identity, before he forgot what it meant to live beyond the job. He traced the routes with his finger, imagining the open road ahead. The shelter didn't need him anymore, not like before. Ava had things well in hand, and Curtis had found his place as a mentor to other veterans. They'd built something sustainable, something that could stand without him. Going somewhere? Ava's voice carried a hint of amusement as she approached the bench. Collins looked up, meeting her knowing smile. "Yeah," he said, folding the map carefully. "Just need to find some peace for a while." Ava nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You've earned it." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Collins parked his old truck outside the shelter. 6 months on the road had left him with grayer hair and deeper laugh lines, but his eyes held a peace that hadn't been there before. He sat for a moment, taking in the familiar building that had changed his life. The shelter looked different now. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and neat flower boxes lined the windows. A new sign hung proudly over the entrance: Johnson Banks Community Center. The sight made him smile. Inside, the atmosphere hummed with purposeful activity. Volunteers moved efficiently through the halls, and residents chatted comfortably in the common areas. Everything ran like clockwork, Ava's clockwork. He found her in what used to be his office, now transformed with organized filing systems and a wall of community resources. She looked up from her paperwork, and her face broke into a wide grin. "What are you doing here, old man?" she asked, standing to greet him. Collins shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Just making sure you're still kicking ass." "Always," she replied, gesturing around the room. "Want the tour? A lot's changed since you've been gone." As they walked through the shelter, Collins noticed all the improvements. The kitchen had been expanded, and Curtis was there, teaching a cooking class to a group of veterans. The older man nodded at Collins but didn't break stride in his lesson. He didn't need to. This was his domain now. "We've got job training programs running 5 days a week," Ava explained, leading him through the new computer lab. "And the second shelter's at full capacity. We're even talking about opening a third location across town." Collins watched her as she spoke, seeing not the scared teenager who once hauled supplies through the rain, but a confident leader who had found her calling. The shelter wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving under her guidance. They ended up in the courtyard, sitting on the same bench where Collins had made his decision to leave 6 months ago. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm gold. "You know," Collins said quietly, "your dad would be proud." Ava's eyes softened at the mention of her father. "I hope so. I'm doing this for him, and for all of us." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the shelter buzz with life around them. Collins felt the last weight lift from his shoulders. This place didn't need him anymore. It had found its true guardian in Ava. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Collins stood outside the shelter, watching people come and go. Just like he used to do in his patrol car, what felt like a lifetime ago. But now, instead of suspicion and duty, he felt pride and peace watching each person walk through those doors. A young woman hurried past him, clutching a backpack too heavy for her frame. For a moment, he saw Ava as she used to be, scared, determined, carrying the weight of others on her shoulders. But times had changed. They'd all changed. Through the window, he could see Curtis leading a group therapy session. The veteran's face was animated as he spoke, his hands moving with purpose. The other veterans leaned in, nodding, understanding. Curtis had found his calling here, just as Ava had found hers. The sound of footsteps made Collins turn. Ava stood beside him, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the director she'd become. Her eyes held the same fire they always had, but now there was confidence there too. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're meant to do. "You ready to go?" she asked softly, understanding the weight of this moment. Collins nodded, taking one last look at the shelter. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'll always remember this place. And you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching as more people filtered in and out of the shelter. A volunteer waved to Ava as she passed, carrying boxes of donated clothes. Inside, the sound of laughter drifted through an open window. Real laughter, the kind that comes from people feeling safe and cared for. "Look at what you've built here," Collins said, gesturing to the bustling shelter. "Your father would be proud." "What we built," Ava corrected him. "None of this would exist without you." Collins shook his head, smiling. "No. This is all you now. You and Curtis. You've made it into something bigger than I ever imagined." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You keep going. Keep fighting. No matter what." Ava nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "We will. We've already come this far. Collins took one last look at the shelter, then turned and walked away. Each step felt lighter than the last. He'd done what he'd set out to do, not just changing their lives, but finding purpose in his own. And now it was time to let go, knowing the fight would continue with Ava leading the way. If you enjoyed the story of Henry, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.